Garden Basics with Farmer Fred is brought to you by Smart Pots, the original lightweight, long-lasting fabric plant container. It's made in the USA. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information and a special discount. That's smartpots.com/Fred. Welcome to the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast. If you're just a beginning gardener or you want good gardening information, well, you've come to the right spot. As 2023 closes and 2024 begins, I like to look back and check out which topics and episodes of the Garden Basics podcast really hit home with our listeners. What were those episodes, and what were the parts in those episodes that attracted the most downloads and listeners? So I'd like to share those with you now. They just might be topics that you missed the first time around, or maybe you want to refresh your memory on a certain garden topic that got a lot of attention. This episode includes info on how to grow vegetables, including tomatoes, squash, and onions, how to start a garden, how to irrigate your garden, and tips for garden success. Well, actually 11 tips to be exact. And it's amazing what you can learn with a repeat listen. I listen to each Garden Basics episode at least 4 times, and I always learn something new each time. So here it is, part 1. It's entitled 2023's Greatest Garden Hits. Part 2, by the way, will be next week. We're podcasting from Barking Dog Studios here in the beautiful Abutilon jungle in suburban Purgatory. It's the Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast, brought to you today by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. Let's go. The National Gardening Association conducted a survey asking, what are your favorite garden vegetables to grow? The NGA, along with the Rapid City, South Dakota Journal newspaper, came up with 10 backyard favorites from coast to coast. You know, that sounds like a pretty good topic for a garden podcast. So master gardener and vegetable expert Gail Pothauer and myself set out to discuss those top 10 and how to grow them, along with our favorite varieties. There's no surprise that the topic gathered so many listeners. It's ranking in the top 10 of the Garden Basics podcast episodes of 2023. What was kind of surprising, though, were the vegetable choices that piqued the curiosity of the most listeners in that 2-part series that aired back in episodes 263 and 264. And we present those very special vegetables to you right now, zucchini and onions. Last week on this Garden Basics podcast, you may recall we were talking about the top 10 garden vegetables grown at home. Gail Pothauer was with us, and we went through tomatoes, cucumbers, sweet peppers, beans, and carrots, and we ran out of time. So this week, we're on to part 2 of the top 10 most popular garden vegetables to grow. It includes summer squash, onions, hot peppers, lettuce, and peas. That according to the National Garden Association and the Rapid City, South Dakota Journal newspaper. Gail, let's get going on 6 through 10.
Yes, let's do that.
Moving on to number 6 in the most popular garden vegetables to plant at home. I laugh because, well, who hasn't had way too many zucchini? Summer squash. And zucchini is just one form of summer squash. There's all sorts of summer squashes.
Oh, yeah. In fact, some of my favorites, my favorite heirloom zucchini, another heirloom, is I'm interested more in heirlooms for tomatoes for the flavors, but there are some other crops that have heirlooms that are really good. It's called Ortolani di Faenza. I don't know how to say it in Italian, but it's a light green zucchini instead of that dark black green that a typical zucchini has. Real prolific, and so I grow that every year. And then there's yellow crookneck, or there's the scallop or the patty pan. So there's a lot of different ones. I love butterbelly. That happens to be a hybrid yellow crookneck. And I grew it up a pallet last year. It's a bush variety, but I wanted to get it up off the ground, so I propped up a pallet and grew it up the pallet. And it saved space, and it was easier to pick, and it was an outstanding variety. It was new for me last year. Zephyr's always a good one. It's a yellow crookneck with green at the bottom, kind of a light green color. And then my favorite scallop is Sunburst. It's a yellow patty pan with a green button on the bottom, and that happens to be an All-America Selection winner.
Among the scallops that are recommended by UC Davis, and these are varieties that you'd probably find at your local nursery if you wanted to plant them from transplants, but they're really best planted from seed. But refer back to our story of why you don't want to cram the roots
just like cucumbers, they don't want their roots disturbed.
Yeah, that's why it really is much easier from seed on summer squash. But Peter Pan hybrid, sunburst, scallopini, early white bush are the scallops recommendations. Among the yellow summer squashes, they like early prolific straight neck, Sundance, early golden summer, crookneck, Dixie. And among the zucchini, Aristocrat, Grazini, Ambassador, Gold Rush, and Burpee Ford Hook. I think a lot of the problems that people have with summer squash is, well, first of all, they're doing the right thing by planting from seed. And usually the recommendations from planting by seed say mound the soil up about 8 inches tall and about 12 inches wide, sort of like a plateau of really enriched soil, maybe mix some manure in there. And then in that plateau, that is 12 inches across, put 6 seeds in a circle and then wait. And then
you don't thin them? No?
You feel, look, it's growing. I don't want to take that out. No. Oh, you better. Honestly, if you have, let's say, 2 mounds of zucchini seed planted and you've got 6 seeds in each and you want a normal sized garden and you don't want too much zucchini, thin it out to 1 per hill. Mm-hmm. Good luck on that.
Yeah. I am sort of hesitant in that I'm going to grow 2 different squash this year. Generally, I do 1. That's plenty for me and my husband. But I'm going to do my favorite zucchini and the yellow crookneck, the butterbelly. I'm going to do 2 different plants, and I'm thinking I might be crazy because that's probably twice as much squash as I need. I've already been collecting recipes on what to do with all that squash.
Good idea.
But it's very prolific, and if you keep harvesting them when they're small, that will keep them producing. If you want to stop the production, let them grow to a baseball bat, and that'll slow them down a little bit.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Ideally, for best flavor, they're best harvested when they're 8 inches or less.
Right.
Yeah.
They'll get too seedy otherwise, when they're starting to get over mature and they'll get real seedy inside. So, yeah.
A lot of people they plant the seeds, the zucchini seeds or the squash seeds in May, and by June they are complaining, look at the fruit that's coming out. It's stunted, it's short, it doesn't look right. What's going on? It's usually incomplete pollination because of the fact that they have separate male and female flowers, and they don't produce male and female flowers necessarily on the same day if it's too hot or too cold. And, the bees sometimes don't help out very much, but usually it's that incomplete pollination. But if you're just patient, if you just wait, you'll get normal size zucchini that the weather will even out, and you will have more zucchini than you know what to do with.
Exactly. Yeah, and generally the male flowers start out first.
Right.
And so you'll have all these flowers and you think, I have no fruit. Well, the female flower will have a little immature fruit at the base of it. And so you can tell the difference. And the males start first, then the females, when they need to get in sync with each other in the morning, because generally they're viable in the morning. And it takes a while, and the weather can disrupt that. So, yeah, you just got to be patient.
As the University of California, Davis says, under good growing conditions, fruits are ready for first harvest 50 to 65 days after seeds are planted. And in the world of summer vegetables, that's pretty darn quick.
It is quick, yes.
Moving on in our list of the 10 most popular garden vegetables to grow at home, number 7 is onions. And onions, Gail, take patience.
Oh, absolutely. And I find growing bulbing onions, the typical big onion, to kind of be a challenge. So I rarely grow onions in my own garden. If I do grow them, I'm going to grow one variety, and it's called Stockton Red. And it's getting a little more difficult to find seeds for Stockton Red, but that's one that I really like. But onions are day length sensitive. So you need to grow a type of onion whether it's long day, short day, intermediate day, or day neutral, depending on your latitude. I think that's where a lot of people have problems. They are growing a variety that maybe isn't suited for their latitude, and so they either bolt prematurely or they don't bulb at all. So with Sacramento being in about a 38-degree latitude, we're intermediate day, so choose varieties that say they're intermediate day or that are day neutral. Day neutral means it doesn't matter. Anybody can grow them. So that's kind of the key. And where I've run into problems, if I buy sets or something, they don't necessarily tell you if they're long day, short day, intermediate day, whatever. And so I'm buying the wrong variety. Stockton Reds I know will do well here, so that's an intermediate day. But onions can be a challenge. And so, as I say, I don't grow them that often. I'll grow green onions, or I'm currently growing Egyptian walking onions, but bulbing onions I don't do too often.
Generally, onions are planted in late summer, early fall here in USDA Zone 9's September, October, and aren't harvested until June or July if you're going for the bulbing onions. Now, green onions are a different story. Green onions or scallions, you can grow those year-round here. Varieties like Evergreen White, Southport White, White Sweet Spanish, White Lisbon, Tokyo Long White, which I planted for the first time this year. And if you use a lot of green onions in your recipe preparations, always have a pot of onions growing.
That's what I found, that green onions are something that I use more. I use regular onions a lot too, but I use a lot of green onions. And so those are easy to grow. I can grow them in a container. I can grow them practically any time of the year. If it's too hot, I can move them into the shade. So yeah, that's a good one to grow.
Yeah, unfortunately, by the time they are ready to harvest, it's not like you can take the onions out and plant something else. Actually, you could. When the onions are harvested, if you reinvigorate the soil, you could probably put in zucchini or another summer squash or a winter squash.
Or set that space aside for planting your fall crop, because some of those can go in August or September. They like to have warm soil to germinate, but they don't necessarily like to have, they need cool climate to mature. So a lot of our cool season crops we would start growing when the soil is still warm, but we want them to mature when it's cooler out. So once you took those onions out, you could then plant something for the fall.
Among the onion bulbing varieties recommended by the University of California, Davis's Vegetable Research and Information Center are Grano, Grain X, California Early Red, Fiesta, Yellow Sweet Spanish, White Sweet Spanish, Southport White Globe, Southport Red Globe, and the Stockton Yellow Globe.
No Stockton Red in there, huh? We actually did an onion variety trial almost 10 years ago at the Fair Oaks Horticulture Center, where we grew several varieties of long day, intermediate day, and short day to see how they would do in our climate. And all the long day bolted, and some of the short day did as well. But that's what's critical, was to grow the right type. And what I mean by long day, intermediate day, and short day is, if you look at a map and you see your latitude, long day are going to be up north. So they need 14 to 16 hours of daylight in order for the bulbing to start. Intermediate day is 12 to 14 hours. Short day is 10 to 12 hours. That's down south. So it does have a lot to do with your latitude.
Yeah, exactly. If you live in Edmonton, you can grow long day onions.
And we did grow them here, and we found they don't do that well. So it doesn't work.
I am not surprised on that. Also making the 2023 Greatest Hits list among listeners to the Garden Basics podcast was a conversation we had about new tomato varieties. This was back in March with nursery owner Don Shore. It originally aired in episode 259. I was just reviewing my notes for my 2022 vegetable garden, and on September 30th, I made this note: shortest tomato season ever. Well, all gardening is local. And here in Northern California, we had one heck of a heat wave in late August and early September, record high temperatures, and that's why it became the shortest tomato season ever. So I am extremely optimistic about 2023. I hope Don Shore is as well. He of Redwood Barn Nursery in Davis, California. And Don, how was your 2022 tomato season?
Well, actually, it was very good, but I have to say that the plants took a lot more water than usual. I was deep irrigating those vines. I was giving them 10 to 12 gallons of water a week, generally all at once if I possibly could, because I'm out in an open field, a normal, garden farm type situation, not a raised planter such as you deal with. As long as I kept them going, kept them vigorous, they did well. But I have to agree with you, that heat wave did a lot of damage to a lot of varieties. If their fruit was exposed on a morning that was going to get over 110 degrees, what I would do actually is pick it and bring it in so that I knew that particular fruit wouldn't get sun scald or sunburn, as typically happens when tomato fruit that's close to ripe is hit by 95, 100, 105 degree temperatures. You know you're going to get some injury on that side of the fruit. 116 degrees, which we recorded 2 days in a row in the Davis area, absolute record, not just for the month, but all-time record, followed by 5 more days over 105. Yeah, it kind of finished up the crop for a lot of people, especially if their plants were drought stressed.
I did put in an optimistic note after I wrote shortest tomato season ever back on September 30th. I pointed out that the Gardener's Delight, the Sweet Million, the Sun Gold, the Valley Girl all have flowers, though. Maybe they will bear fruit. And then I turned the page to October. And on October 25th, I wrote, removed remaining tomato plants. Shortest tomato season ever. Thanksgiving tomatoes are commonplace here. Christmas tomatoes aren't that unusual, but last year they were.
A lot of them finished up, and that heat just finally took its toll. I did have a couple of varieties that really impressed me for their ability to continue later on. Usually there's a half dozen varieties that'll keep setting, keep fruiting all the way through October and into November. But I do want to mention one all-time top 10 champion just kept on going. I was still picking those in early November. And I've got to bring this one in, New Girl.
Yeah.
New Girl is giving Early Girl a run for the money because it was continuing to fruit all the way through October.
New Girl was one of my better performers while tomato season existed in 2022. I will be planting New Girl again, as well as its sibling, Valley Girl.
Yes, these are all competitors to the throne of one of California's absolute favorite varieties. Early Girl has been an all-purpose hybrid tomato here since the 1970s. It's very, very popular, and for good reason. It sets early, it holds and ripens early, and then when we don't typically get a lot of fruit on it through the hottest part of the summer, you almost always get that late August, early September set when we get cooler periods, which we do. And they'll ripen here, since we have such a long season, usually sunny and warm all the way into the mid part of October. You'll still often be picking Early Girl as late as, well, as you know, even as late as Thanksgiving. Because of that, there have always been breeders out there looking to be the next Early Girl, and I think we've got a couple of them that are actually good contenders for that now.
Last year, in 2022, the seed company Seeds and Such, because I must have ordered some seeds from them, they sent me a complimentary package of a hybrid tomato called Early Doll. And I decided, I saw that sitting there in the box of seeds, and I go, well, I'll try that this year. It germinated, as I would expect, even though it allegedly was packaged for the year 2022. Packaged tomato seeds can last, 4 or 5 years. So I have high hopes for Early Doll, although I don't see it in their latest catalog, but they do have it online. And the Early Doll, supposedly, yeah, I know, maybe that's why it was part of the 2022 free seed giveaway. It says it's one of the earliest tomatoes we have ever offered, says Seeds and Such online. 55 days from planting to fruiting.
Early Doll. Well, yeah, 55 days is great, and we'll certainly see if that one gets into their list. I mean, this company has come up with a couple of real good ones, and you and I both know that the one that they were sending out as a freebie 3 years ago, we all gave them great feedback on the one that they've now labeled It's a Keeper, which is very productive. It set well, set early, very firm fruit. And I'll mention that one took the heat very well as well. So we've got to keep trying these. I have a feeling, I'm not sure why, there's going to be more hot spells in our future.
Yeah.
It'll be advisable for us to make notes, not just about what sets early and what produces well into the season, but what takes direct hot sun well on the fruit and on the vigor of the vine. I mean, this is something that's going to be, future gardeners may wish to know about our experiences changes with extreme heat as things change. Let's put it that way.
So last year, I tried 3 new tomato varieties for me. I tried the It's a Keeper, Big Beef Plus, and Bodacious. And I noticed that in my notes throughout the spring and summer, I don't mention them anymore. So I'm not so sure I would plant them again.
Bodacious has done very well for me 3 years in a row, and it did very well last year. It's actually one of my top producers of all the new varieties that I've been trying. So I do urge people to try that one. You're only going to be able to get the seed for that, I believe, from Burpee Seed Company. I think it's theirs.
Yes.
And it's not something you're not going to find it at most garden centers. I do know a small one in Davis that's likely to have it stocked, but not everybody around is going to, because the seed is not cheap, let me tell you.
With that, now that you're taking us on a nice scenic bypass that has me scratching my head, is I was at a big box store at their garden center portion of the big box store, and I was looking at those poor young sacrificial tomato plants that are 1 inch or 2 inches tall that people are buying now, even though, like I say, we're waiting for our first 80-degree day. Heck, we would settle for a 70-degree day. So I feel sorry for those tomato plants. But they had, actually, to their credit, they had a good supply of cool season vegetables, which still make a lot of sense to plant in USDA Zone 9 in March and April, because you're going to get 2 more months, unless the heat sets in extra early, of growth. Sure. But the price.
Leafy lettuces, yeah.
The price, Don, a 4-inch tomato plant was going for $5.95. A 6-pack of cool season vegetables, small babies, little ones, $6.98. It's like the price doubled overnight.
Maybe I better raise my prices. That sounds pretty good. Yes, the prices have definitely gone up, and there's a couple of reasons that are fairly obvious for that. One is the cost of heating greenhouses. You don't get tomato seedlings available in March if you don't have a heated greenhouse. As you know, if you do it at home, you've got to do them indoors, move them out, move them in, move them out. They're not doing that in big wholesale yards. They're using propane or natural gas to heat those greenhouses. Greenhouses don't work when it's cloudy. So we've had a lot of cloudy days, like say 50, 70% of our days have been cloudy from January, February into March. So the greenhouses weren't working real well anyway. And the cost of seed is definitely going up. And what you'll find is that there's a lot of growers that just aren't going to take on a brand new, untested, untried variety, no matter how exaggerated or, let's say, retail oriented the claims in the catalogs are, because of the cost of the seed. I've got one grower that tells me he's not going to do anything that's cost more than a nickel a seed, but some of these are closer to 50 cents or more a seed. I'll try them. You'll try them. I'll see if they do well. And I do mention, coming back to Bodacious, that one has been very consistent for me now, including during extreme heat. To me, it's the best alternative to a beefsteak that you're going to get here in the Sacramento Valley or regions like the Valley where it gets so hot in the summer. It takes the heat much better than a beefsteak type, and it's a similar slicer. You can slice it it's got a lot of that connective tissue that holds together for a sandwich, makes great sauce, salsas, things like that. But I do have a rule. I don't recommend a variety until I've grown it for at least 2 seasons, preferably very different seasons. We just went through a very hot summer. We've had cooler summers. And it is never the same variety that's consistent, with very few exceptions. Bodacious so far is a real winner for me. I'm not sure whether yours was just a fluke or something, but I do suggest trying it again and test it for 2 or 3 seasons before you rule it out. Big Beef is a good example. First year I grew it, it was great. 30, 35 fruit, close to a pound a piece. I thought, we've got a winner here. The next year I grew it 10 fruit. So that does happen. And you need to test them for a couple years under a range of conditions.
This may be the reason why, because of fear of the weather, you might say that I probably am leaning this year to smaller tomatoes that will ripen quicker. So I'm guaranteed some tomatoes. The tomatoes I've chosen, I think, the biggest one might be 8 ounces. Is a Better Boy about 8 ounces?
Yeah, that's about right. All Champion is in the same size range. Yeah, there's a whole bunch of red tomatoes that are classic, reliable. Better Boy, Champion, Delicious, Whopper. Those are 4 that I find very similar in how we use them, generally very similar in their performance. Of the 4, the most consistent year to year has been Champion, and it's easy to remember the name, but all 4 of those are good. Better Boy has been very consistent over the years. You get into the really big ones, you are taking some gambles. It seems to me from experience that there's more issues with blossom end rot. For example, when you have a very large tomato and you get it in early and it gets going and its fruit sets fruit, you get all excited, and then you notice that the bottom is discoloring on the fruit, and that one's going to be gushy on the bottom and no good. We know probably that's a temperature temperature and moisture related phenomenon, but it does seem to hit the bigger ones worse, or maybe it's just that it's more disappointing when it does. I'm not sure. The key is diversify your portfolio.
Yes.
Good advice across the board. Get some interesting sauce tomatoes, because in my experience, a lot of those are just very consistent, reliable. Cherry tomatoes, you can't go wrong with cherry tomatoes. Juliet, that's a sort of an in-between one that's cherry sized but firm textured, incredibly popular. Can be a little hard to find this year, so look around for it. But try to get a whole bunch of different kinds. And a couple early varieties are a very good plan. And make sure you get something interesting out there so you can test some new varieties. But you're right. I think the big ones, you are asking. I don't do nothing but oversized tomatoes. Let's put it that way. I grow the Big Zack hybrid, the one that's grown actually as a championship-sized tomato. I've had great years. One year I got 35 fruit. All of them were over a pound. They were all beautiful. One year I got 3. And, that's a pretty big range. If it was the only one I planted, I would have been a little disappointed.
Well, you bring up a good point, too, is that, for one thing, all gardening is local, as we're kind of talking about here, and everybody's results are going to be different. But one thing that you've talked about in the past that makes a heck of a lot of sense is buy local. Buy those tomatoes that were developed where you live. And we've often used the example of that classic heirloom tomato Brandywine, which I imagine does fine in Brandywine, Pennsylvania.
Which I think is a fairly mild climate as far as I can tell, at least compared to what we have here. And there's a seed breeder up in Maxwell, California, that's been introducing some phenomenal tomatoes. Maxwell is about as valley as you can get here in the Sacramento Valley. They certainly get as hot as we do, if not hotter up there. Most people go by Maxwell on Highway 5 and don't really notice it, but there's a really good deli there.
There's a golf course there, too.
There is. And there's a breeder of tomatoes. The Chef's Choice series have all been introduced by a company up in Maxwell. And every one of them so far has been a real winner. Particularly, I've mentioned it many times on your program, Chef's Choice Orange, one of the first ones they came out with. Top performer for me year after year, big fruit, very firm. Now they have yellow and, of course, red and pink and striped and purple. And I think there's even a white one and now a black one. Several of these have won the All-America Selection designation, which I think you can explain better as to having been tested in a wide range of circumstances.
Exactly. They have test gardens from coast to coast in many different climates. They have national winners. They have regional winners as well. And if you go to allamericaselections.org, you can find their complete list and be prepared to download a large PDF of all those winners. But yeah, if you go by that, that's not a bad barometer to use for choosing tomato varieties. How about among your customers? What have they been raving or poo-pooing about in the last year?
Juliet continues to be extremely popular. Sun Gold as the top cherry tomato. There's always new ones coming along that try to challenge Sun Gold for that position. And there are some really good cherry tomatoes out there, but that one continues to be just one of the favorites. By the way, one of the favorites everywhere. When I posted a question on a Facebook group of nursery professionals, what are your top 5 tomatoes? Sun Gold was on almost every single list, as was, just for the record, Early Girl. So those are consistent. Champion continues to be very good. I do have a lot of older customers, I'm not sure why, who seem to really like Ace. And these older guys and their celebrity, I'll tell you, you and I aren't huge fans of celebrity, but there are some people out there that just clamor for it. So it's a good producer. I've had issues with sunburn on it and other things, but I have to bring it in for those guys. You know how these old gardener guys are. They can be kind of grumpy.
Yes.
They don't have what they're after. The other thing is a lot of them are still asking about heirloom types. I've gradually gotten to the point where if someone walks up with just heirloom tomatoes to the counter, I say, I want to suggest you try a hybrid too, just to see how it performs compared to those. Because you mentioned Brandywine. That's a good example. Very popular. Rarely produces more than 1 or 2 fruit here, has been my experience. It doesn't take the heat well. There's others. There's other heirlooms out there. Mortgage Lifter, it does reasonably well most years for me. Cherokee Purple has done extremely well for me. It was my top producer in 2021. Of all my tomatoes, the largest number of fruit was Cherokee Purple of all things. So it's a good one for the valley and a good one for hot climates. But you've got to try different things and be sure to get at least 1 or 2 in there that are hybrids and preferably that have that hybrid built-in disease resistance that can be very important in some areas.
The heirloom that has done well for me consistently over the past probably 15 years is Gardener's Delight. It's not as small as a cherry. It's more like a plum size or a little bit bigger tomato. And it does produce throughout the season and is usually my latest performer as well, Gardener's Delight. And as far as
consistent,
good cherry tomato that I've always grown, it seems, and I still grow it because it keeps performing, is Sweet Million.
Sweet Million, Super Sweet 100, these are all in the same category of just very, very heavy producers. Now, most cherry tomatoes don't have hybrid disease resistance built in. Cherry tomatoes in general had not had that. And if you're listening in an area where diseases are prevalent, you might look for the disease resistance listings on the label of some of the newer hybrids, because that can be a problem, especially in places where people have rainfall during the summer. But I would say that the Sweet 100, Sweet Million crowd, you can't go wrong with them. And in general, cherry tomatoes, of course, are very, very successful. I do want to mention one that's a local favorite over in the Davis area, because we've got an older gentleman who's been advising the master gardeners here for years, and he's absolutely right about 4th of July. 4th of July is a consistent performer. You will have fruit by the 4th of July, even if you plant it on about the 1st of May, as I've done to test that. It's very pretty, bright red, good flavors, small, 3 to 4 ounce fruit, very productive, relatively compact plant. It's actually described as being, we'll do some jargon here, determinate. But my experience is it continues after that first wave of fruit and continues to produce later into the season. So it's been a very consistent performer, and I find myself recommending it to novice gardeners along with a cherry tomato and a good hybrid and maybe one heirloom that catches their fancy because of the name or something like that. And that's 3 or 4 plants. Should give you enough tomatoes for a summer if you're just a first-time gardener.
Coming up, it's no surprise that one of the most listened to Garden Basics podcast episodes had to do with watering your garden. We have effective irrigation tips right after this. For over a year now, I've been making some of the best compost I've ever had in a Smart Pot compost sack. The end result is a beautiful compost called leaf mold, and it's made from fallen oak leaves. And the best part of all, it's easy with the Smart Pot compost sack. All I'm doing is running over those fallen oak leaves with a mulching mower and then loading those shredded leaves into the 100-gallon Smart Pot compost sack. It's a fabric bag from the folks at Smart Pots that's lightweight yet extremely durable and lasts for years. It can hold 12 cubic feet of pure compost. This rugged fabric is entirely porous, containing many micropores that allows for air circulation and drainage. It has a fitted cover, too. It's a flexible plastic top that's designed to increase heat and help manage moisture in the mix, accelerating the compost process. And all you have to do in the meantime is wait. Load the Smart Pot compost sack in the fall, and the following year, you've got some truly great compost to add to your garden bed. It's really gardener's gold. It's easy to start a compost pile with the Smart Pot compost sack. Open the sack, put it on level ground, and start adding your compostable materials like grass clippings, vegetable peelings, coffee grounds, and more, like oak leaves. And you can also add straw or shredded paper. Next, place the optional cover over the sack. That's all there is to it. And if you want even faster results, get a second Smart Pot compost sack and shovel the contents of one into the other, adding a bit of organic fertilizer that has nitrogen. The more often you do that, the quicker you're going to get a finished compost. Smart Pots, they're available at independent garden centers and select Ace and True Value hardware stores nationwide. You can find the location nearest you at their website, smartpots.com/Fred. And when you visit their website at smartpots.com/Fred, you can buy the Smart Pots online. Just visit smartpots.com/Fred, and don't forget that /Fred part, because on that page are details about how, for a limited time, you can get 10% off your Smart Pot order by using the coupon code FRED, F-R-E-D, at checkout. It's from the Smart Pot store. Visit smartpots.com/Fred for more information about the complete line of Smart Pot's lightweight, colorful, award-winning fabric containers and their latest, the compost sack. It's Smart Pots, the original award-winning fabric planter. Go to smartpots.com/Fred. The Garden Basics Greatest Hits of 2023 continues with answers to the questions every gardener wonders about at one point or another. How long should I water my flowers, fruits, and vegetables? From episode 265, it's Soil Irrigation Basics, featuring organic garden expert and soil pedologist Steve Zion. It's been a wet winter and a wet spring for much of the western United States, but the fact of the matter is, downpours, heavy rains, atmospheric rivers can happen in just about any portion of the country. And sometimes it's followed by a bout of maybe warmer weather, and you start feeling hot, and you think, oh, my plants are hot, I should give them water. Whoa! Before you do that, let's cover some irrigation basics. What should you do, especially after a wet winter? Farmers are tackling this problem throughout the western United States right now. Home gardeners should be tackling it as well. How do you handle your soil after a full wet winter and early spring? We're talking with Steve Zion, our friend, our organic horticulture educator and longtime organic gardening specialist. Steve, let's cover some irrigation basics here. And I know that the number one answer, of course, is it depends, because when people say, well, how long should I run my irrigation system? Well, it depends. But I think the first step would be to check your soil moisture before you turn on your sprinklers or your drip irrigation system.
Exactly. And a lot of people, when they check for soil moisture, they look at the surface of the soil. And after one sunny day, that surface of the soil will look bone dry. But you go a quarter of an inch below that in most cases, and the soil can be either moist or even wet. And so the first thing you've got to realize when you're trying to determine the soil's moisture is ignore what the surface looks like. You need to actually dig down into the soil, and there's a specialized tool. There's actually two really, really great tools to help you basically dig into the soil, pull a column of soil out so that you can examine 6, 8, 12, 18, 24 inches, depending upon how long what the tool is called is a soil probe. If it's a 12-inch soil probe, it's basically most often a stainless steel or chrome tube, and about half of it on the side is open and exposed. So you push it into the ground, you pull it out, and you will actually be able to see and touch the soil that's in that tube, and you'll be able to see whether that soil is moist or dry.
Soil probes are nifty tools that every gardener should have. So are soil moisture meters. We'll get into that in a minute or two. But with soil probes, it's shaped like a letter T, so you have a very sturdy handle to hold on to help you plunge it into the soil. And the reason you want to go down 8 inches, 12 inches, that's the root zone of where your plants are growing. Because what we're trying to do here is making sure that the root area, which is the area that absorbs the water, is functioning correctly.
Exactly. You want to know kind of the size of the plant, and little tiny plants, young seedlings, when you're just putting them in, the roots might go down a couple of inches. But as those plants grow during the season, if it's an annual, like a vegetable or something, they can go down 12 inches, 18 inches, or, in some cases, if you've got really nice loose soil, 24 or 36 inches. And tree roots go down numerous feet. There is very limited research as to how far the roots go down. I like to water my large shrubs and trees using a drip system for hours to get that water down about 6 feet or more. A lot of people say, well, you're wasting water. Well, if you get the roots down that far, you don't have to water as frequently, because you can let the top, 6 inches or 12 inches go dry, because the feeding roots are down below.
Yeah, it's all about the roots. It's all about the soil as far as determining where and how long you should water. And all soils are different. You've got heavy clay soils, you have sandy soils. And for those of you who are saying, no way could I push a soil probe down 12 inches in my crappy soil because of hardpan or rocks or whatever, well, there are options available. And the old-fashioned way was to basically hand dig down the root zone, down 8 to 12 inches, grab a handful of the soil that was down at that level, make a ball of it in your hand and squeeze it. If water rolled down your arm, the soil is too wet. If, on the other hand, it fell apart as soon as you opened up your hand, it's too dry. On the other hand, if you squeezed that ball of soil and it broke up with a little bit of effort, that is what is called field capacity moisture, which is the ideal amount for whatever you might be growing.
And what that basically means is you've got different sized pore spaces in your soil. And if you have good soil structure, if you got a healthy soil, you have a diversity of different sized pore spaces. And the large pore spaces allow the water and the air and fertilizer and roots and biology to move through the soil fairly effectively. What's really nice is we got to realize that the life in the soil, which includes our plant roots and the beneficial soil biology and worms and all the other critters that live down there, they need air as much as they need oxygen. And so when you irrigate, and if that soil is saturated, like a lot of the soils were, during these atmospheric rivers, the large pore spaces are filled with water. But in time, when we don't have the atmospheric rivers moving through, and typically throughout the year, after you irrigate a short period of time, the water will drain by the force of gravity out of those large pore spaces, so you have air. And that's one of the reasons why you don't want to irrigate too frequently. If you're irrigating too frequently, you're going to always be filling up those large pore spaces with water and depriving the life in the soil of oxygen and air, and you will be encouraging disease organisms.
And that brings up another very good point, too, is after a heavy rain, don't be tromping on your garden's soil, because that compacts the soil, which also removes those very necessary air pockets.
Exactly. You want to avoid compaction, and one of the easiest ways to avoid compaction is stay off the soil when it's wet. The easiest way to figure out whether it's too wet or not is to just take a handful of soil, take a hand trowel and dig up a little bit of soil, roll it in your hand, and then drop it onto a hard surface like a piece of concrete or a stepping stone or something like that. And if it just goes splat and flattens like a pancake, then it's too wet. It should, when it hits the ground, it should kind of break apart a little bit.
As opposed to if it's too dry, well, it wouldn't even reach the ground probably in one piece.
Yeah, it would shatter more than crumble.
Now, one reason I like the soil probe is it doesn't require batteries. There's nothing on there really that's going to break. And because you've got that open slot on the side, you plunge that probe into the soil, give it a quarter turn, lift it back out, and then you can examine the soil that has been taken by that probe that you'll see in the side. What should you be looking for? What should you be feeling for in that sample?
Well, when you're talking about irrigation, moisture, and one of the nice things is you can pull it out, and again, you can roll it up in a ball and see if it squeezes and moisture comes out. You'll be able to tell. It takes a little bit of time, but for most plants, you want that soil in that probe to be somewhat dry before you irrigate, unless it's a plant that needs moist soil. But for most of our plants, you want that soil to dry out a little bit in between irrigation.
And that brings up the other good point of when is the best time to use a soil probe or a soil moisture meter, and that's before you turn on the drip irrigation system or the sprinklers.
Exactly. And then, a lot of people also ask not only, when should I irrigate, but how much? And there again, there's that magic word. It depends. Everybody's soil is different, and the environmental conditions are different. And so what I typically tell people to do is run their irrigation system. First use the soil probe. Make sure that the soil is somewhat dry and needs irrigation. Then run your irrigation system maybe half or maybe even a quarter as long as you normally do. Then you turn it off, wait an hour so that gravity will pull that water down as far as it's going to go. And then you push in that soil probe again and pull it out, and you will actually be able to see and feel how far down that water's gone. And if it's gone down 4 inches and you know the roots of your plants are going down 12 inches, you've got water 3 times longer.
How many probes do you need to do on a sample size? Let's say it's, 200 square feet. And maybe there's a bit of a slope to it. Do you take that probe and stick it in at the top of the hill or the bottom of the hill, or how do you do it?
Your best off is taking about 10 cores randomly throughout the area. And it's really a good idea to pay attention to what the soil looks like. And more importantly, take some of the soil out of the soil probe and play with it in your hand. And you're going to want to kind of get a feel for what's called the texture of the soil, which is the percentage of sand, silt, and clay. And sand will feel gritty. Silt will feel like flour. And clay, when it is moist, will be slippery. When it's hard or when it's dry, it will feel hard. Pay attention maybe to the amount of organic matter, the color. Typically, the more organic matter that you have in the soil, the darker it will be. And you sometimes will find that the soil on the top of the hill is dramatically different from the bottom of the hill. If you're using raised beds, the soil in one raised bed might be dramatically different from another because the soil that you brought in was brought in from 2 different sources. Where you find that the soils are different, they may need to be irrigated differently.
Yeah, I got a email from a listener who stumbled upon the Farmer Fred Rant blog page, and most of those little newsletters are about 13 years old. And I think in one of them, I was mentioning how I water with drip irrigation in one of my raised beds, one of my original raised beds back in the mid-1990s. And I pointed out that with drip irrigation on a raised bed, you need, as you mentioned earlier, you need to run it for a long time. And I was talking about hours at a time. The one thing I've learned over the years about soil and raised beds, that initial soil that you put in there is going to drain swiftly and in a very small footprint, almost like a cylinder. The more you change the soil by adding compost and mulch, the darker that soil becomes and the richer the soil becomes and the more water holding capacity it has. And I've found over the years, I don't have to run it for as many hours as I used to run it on a raised bed, because you mentioned the nice, rich, black, earthy tone of the soil and the wonderful smell of it. And of course, all the worms working through it. Well, that's what I have now. And I can get away with maybe a couple of hours of irrigation twice a week in the heat of the summer.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it always amazes me when I read, folks' comments in various blogs and on Facebook groups where people say that drip irrigation doesn't work for vegetables or it doesn't work for trees, and because the water doesn't get down deep enough. Well, the only reason the water doesn't get down deep enough is you don't leave it on long enough.
Well, that, and they're putting it in the wrong place. So many people will keep a drip irrigation emitter right next to the trunk. And that's fine when you plant it. But as that plant grows, it's sending roots out. And by putting your drip lines in a concentric circle extending outward from the plant, you're encouraging the roots to go even more outward. So as your plants grow, you need to add on to that drip irrigation system.
And as the tree grows, you have to realize, and this is true with most plants, as the plant grows, there's what's called the drip line. And just assume the foliage is like an umbrella, and then it rains, and the water that falls on that umbrella when it hits the ground is called the drip line. And a lot of people think that that's where the end of the roots are, and that's maybe where you should be irrigating and fertilizing. And that actually is in the middle of the root zone. The root zone actually extends 2 to 3 times beyond that. And so we need to be irrigating and fertilizing and putting compost and worm castings and mulch 2 to 3 times beyond those outermost branches.
I've discovered, too, with drip irrigation lines, the parallel lines that run the length of, say, a 4-foot by 8-foot bed. I remember on my first raised beds, I had 3 lines running, not realizing that it would be a very narrow cylinder of water emitting from each emitter. And it finally dawned on me after much experimentation that you need more parallel lines. So now in raised beds, I will usually run in a 4-foot bed. I will run 5 parallel lines, the length of the bed. So there's maybe 8-9 inches, maybe a little bit more than 9 inches apart from each line. But the footprint of the water is going to be wider because the soil has improved over the years. So you've got that overlapping effect that guarantees that all portions of the raised bed are going to get water.
It's kind of like soil texture. Your soil texture determines when you're applying like irrigation from a drip source, like a drip emitter, where will that water go when that water hits the soil? In a clay soil, it has primarily smaller pores, and the water actually gets sucked into and through the soil. And not only will it get sucked down, but it'll get sucked out. And so when you're talking about your raised bed being improving in quality, it's, you're getting more diversity in the pore spaces, and it will allow the water to move laterally as well as just down. Typically your sandy soils, if you're actually out in the garden, that water is going to, primarily go straight down from your drip emitters. If you're using drip emitters on a clay soil, that's going to spread out pretty far. And so what I generally recommend is if you're like doing a vegetable garden or starting to use drip system, put a line out there, run it for a couple of hours, and then wait an hour and see where that water is going and how far out from this laterally is that water traveling. And the surface, just by looking at it, it's going to look like it's not moving sideways very far at all. You've got to use that soil probe and go down several inches to see whether it's spreading out and how far it's spreading out.
A narrow water cylinder in very sandy soil might only be a few inches wide, maybe 7, 8, maybe 9 inches wide. For a heavy, if that, yeah. For a heavy clay soil, it could be 18 to 20 inches. For a loamy soil, it's somewhere in between that.
Exactly.
Visit any nursery in the waning days of summer or early autumn, and you'll see the signs that say fall is for gardening. Well, why is that? And what should you consider before starting a cool season garden? That topic attracted enough listeners to launch that episode to one of the top 10 most listened to Garden Basic podcast episodes in 2023. And it didn't hurt that it featured the advice of America's favorite retired college horticultural professor, Debbie Flower. We like to answer your garden questions here on the Garden Basics podcast. Farmer Fred here. Debbie Flowers here, America's favorite retired college horticultural professor. You are here.
I am here.
Good.
Yes.
Let's answer some questions. Marina writes in, actually she texted us from Santa Cruz, California, along the coast. Santa Cruz is a wonderful beachfront city with a great old wooden roller coaster. Mm-hmm. But it is an area of the coast that has many climates because the ocean front is maybe 1 mile, 2 miles wide before it starts to go uphill immediately.
Right. Very many different microclimates as a result.
And this will all make sense to you when I tell you what Marina is asking. She says, this fall, I will be moving into a small apartment with some college friends and plan to start my very first food garden to provide fresh produce for the 4 of us. I got some free seeds from my University of California, Santa Cruz Life Lab garden internship, including bok choy, lettuce, spinach, arugula, and radishes. I also got 2 onion varieties, parsley, larkspur, and stock to plant for the spring. I will only be living in the apartment for 1 year, so I'm looking for advice on small area, temporary, first-time gardening strategies, including soil and containers, pest control, watering, and what I should and should not plant. Thank you.
She doesn't ask for much.
No, not much at all there. Well, Marina, what I really like the fact is it's not fall yet, and she's already thinking about fall planting as a good gardener should.
Yes, she's planning ahead. That's wonderful.
Yeah, and especially it doesn't make sense at all that in the heat of the summer, you actually could be starting your fall garden.
Yes, you could.
In a lot of situations, it might be starting seeds indoors. Mm-hmm. The nurseries don't realize it's fall till about September or so, and then they'll start getting in the cool season plants.
Right.
But
the seeds are out there already.
Yeah, right. For gardeners who like to try different varieties, and especially in the world of Chinese cabbages, the bok choy, there are just so many varieties.
Yes, there are.
Worth trying. So you're off to a good start there, Marina, by doing some planning. I think at the Garden Basics podcast, you could probably find some episodes that we've talked about in the past that you would find helpful. I know episode number 12 on your first garden could be helpful. Also, since this is a temporary garden, I imagine you'll be doing it in containers. I didn't see that, though, in your
She asked
text.
She's looking for advice, including soil and containers.
Okay, all right. So we don't know. It might be a mix of a small plot there at the apartment complex.
Yes, could be.
And containers. So there's that. We do have a good episode that we did on containers, episode 256, called Container Gardening, that you may want to check out. I like her selection of easy to grow crops that she has. She has a lot of root crops and greens, and those are easy to grow.
Right. And she has them separated pretty much as they should be for the seasons. The bok choy, lettuce, spinach, arugula, radishes, onion from seed. You've done that before. Mm-hmm. Start in fall. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Parsley, larkspur, stock. Stock is a flower, as is larkspur. Will definitely do well. Now, I would plant them now for the fall also, but they could be a spring crop as well.
And with some crops, you do get them started in the fall, mm-hmm. and the harvest may not be till, I don't know. For me, it was today with onions that I planted last October.
And you planted them from seed.
And I planted them from seed, yeah. Mm-hmm. So it does take a while.
Yes, some things do. So if she's going to be there a year, she should be able to get a crop out of those onions. Yeah. But the first thing I thought of was location. Mm-hmm. Where should she grow these edibles and flowers? I have you've seen many gardens that were started by first-time gardeners, and they were in full shade, and that's not going to work for these crops. So they need to be in a place that gets 6 to 8 hours of full sun, so unobstructed sun, no shade from a tree above or from the house or anything like that, but only 6 to 8 hours out of the 24 that we call one day.
My concern with it being Santa Cruz would be marine influence, where your light is limited.
Could be, yes.
Morning fog.
Yeah. Yes. And that will, so if you have lots of fog, you need to double those hours. If it were foggy all day long, you would want them in a sunny place, as sunny as you can get, for 12 to 16 hours.
Well, and we should point out that's really only for certain crops. A lot of the greens that she suggested could be grown in the shade.
True. They can produce with less sun. Actually, everything, the bok choy, lettuce, spinach, arugula, radishes, everything except the flowers. The flowers, they could take their cool season flowers, so they can take the shorter end, the 6-hour end of that sun exposure.
Yeah, generally root crops aren't too picky about that as well. So being that she was an intern at UC Santa Cruz gardening,
yes,
she has a good start.
She knows some things.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's a good thing.
So besides looking at the sun conditions, the other couple of other things I like to think about when I'm locating a garden is it near water? Mm-hmm. Because you're going to have to water these. Now, not as much as we maybe have to in the valley here, because Santa Cruz is a foggier place, but she's still going to need to water them. And someplace where you can see them on a regular basis from inside the house, so that you remember, oh yeah, look, they're wilting. I better get out there and water.
And in an apartment house, it might be on your way from the car to the apartment. If you pass it by and reminds you to get out there and do something.
Or it might be on a deck or a patio.
And if you are in a container, your least expensive source of potting soil might be the bag soil. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't use soil from the parking lot.
Correct. Right. In a container, you want to use what's called soilless mix.
Right.
And you can make your own, and that might require too many inputs for somebody who's going to move quickly, because you're going to need a big bag of several things. But if you make your own, it's a 1-to-1-to-1, which means 1 part of an organic component, which would be peat moss or coir or compost. then 1 part of a rock component, perlite or pumice or sand, and then 1 part of vermiculite. Vermiculite's kind of a unique product, and for me, I like to definitely include some vermiculite. And you mix them together, and that's your media. Then you'll need some nutrition.
And that's not leftover beer, I would think. It sounds like it's a college apartment house.
Yeah, or close to it, yeah. Yeah, no beer. Fertilizer. Mm-hmm. If you're using peat moss, you'll have to add a little bit of lime, garden lime to the oyster shell lime is a one type to the mix to adjust your pH. But everything, once they have germinated from seed, they don't need it to germinate, but once they're growing, they will need nutrition. They will need fertilizer.
Being Santa Cruz is a fairly organic place.
Right.
I would think manure might be readily available, but I would be very cautious about your source of that manure and what those animals were treated with.
Right. Were you thinking fresh manure?
I don't know what
not
I was
bagged,
thinking. No, not bagged. I was thinking that there may be a petting zoo on the campus of Santa Cruz or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. I don't think they have a petting zoo, but you never know.
Right. But cattle, chickens, goats, all have, that would be something you'd have to research because they're horses too. They'll have their manure all has different qualities to it. And yes, you need to know what they've been eating because what they've been eating comes out in the poop. And if they've been eating stuff that has been treated with herbicides, that can also come out in the poop and can ruin your garden.
Yes, especially if it's fresh manure.
Yes.
And I would say that if you have availability to manure, probably the best place to put it would be in a hot compost bin.
And yes, and leave it for a while till the smell goes away and it has broken down.
So, Marina, if you wanted to, you could give up your parking space there at the apartment house and you can convert it to a 3-bin composting system.
Oh, there you go. I thought you were going to say you could have the manure delivered there. I had that done in my driveway when I first had a house in Portland, Oregon, and the guy who came, it was from a dairy farm, I was at work, so I wasn't home. He didn't want to drop it off because apparently that's a joke people do is order manure for someone else's house. But he did. Eventually, my neighbor convinced him I was the type of person who would want this.
Yes.
Yes.
You know, one nice thing, though, if you had the space there to build a raised bed, would be the ease with which you could attach a translucent top made of glass, polyethylene, or fiberglass and have a cold frame just in case it gets a little too cold for whatever you might be growing in the wintertime.
Yes, you could trap some heat. You know, you could do it with containers. You would have to group them together and then use a heat blanket, which is typically sold here. I'm thinking of Santa Cruz being so close to the ocean. I don't know how readily available that would be, but it certainly would be available mail order.
Yeah.
And when you use a heat blanket, and it's not that heavy, not as heavy as I think of blankets being. It's something different. You need to spread it all over the plants and all the way to the ground because you're trapping the heat that's coming out of the ground. Now, if this is a 2nd-story apartment and you're on a deck, it's not going to be as helpful.
When you say heat blanket, can I say frost cloth?
Yes, you can.
Okay, would it be the same thing?
Yes.
Okay, all right. So, and frost cloths come in different weight, too.
They do.
And I wouldn't get the lightest, but maybe one of the thicknesses that's in between that and the thickest one. For most, mild areas, that would be sufficient. You're just looking for 2 to 3 degrees of protection.
Right. Doesn't take much.
Yeah. And it's, you may not need it. In fact, if they are in containers, you could probably bring them inside if you had to.
Right. Or closer to the house anyway. That gives them less exposure to the coldness outside.
All right. Fertilizers, yes, for a container, you would have to, because if you're watering it, you're also leaching out nutrients.
Right. So your containers are going to have holes in the bottom. They have to have drainage.
Right, yeah.
And the water's going to go through and out. And when you plant into the container, you want some what's called headroom, which means that the media does not come all the way to the top of the container. You have half-inch between the top of the media and the top of the container, so that when you water thoroughly, meaning you fill up that whole headroom, that space between the media and the top of the container completely, and then let it go through. And you do that maybe again so that you're getting some water out of, it's called the leaching fraction, some water out of the bottom of the container. And that, yes, it will contain nutrients that the plant has not used. And that's a good thing, because if those unused nutrients build up in the container, it raises the media's pH or alkalinity, and it can limit the growth of the plant.
As far as fertilizers go, to replenish the plants, I like single-digit fertilizers. By that, I mean those 3 numbers you see on the front of the box or the bag or the bottle are single digits. Your nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium content, like a 511, which is typical of fish emulsion, or a 444, or something along those lines. You would have to do it probably more regularly than you would if it was planted in the ground. I have this gnawing memory in the back of my head of creating a problem in an apartment thousands of years ago where I was watering plants on the little outside deck of my second-story apartment and didn't think twice about where the water was going. And when the water goes down, well, it's going to leave the pot. And then where it's going to go? Oh, it's going to stick around the wood of that second deck, which eventually rotted.
Right.
So you might have to get pretty creative when it comes to thinking about how are you going to drain the water away.
Right. Well,
and how are you going to protect the surfaces of something you don't own?
I like to have all my containers on a rolling platform. They sell smaller ones at the garden center. They're not cheap. You can make your own out of wood. Skateboards, that would work. Yeah. I like to have wheels on it so I can move the plant around easily. But I also like that it lifts. The wheels also lift the container and the platform that is the lift off of the deck or whatever it is, so air can get underneath, and that will help it dry out and prevent this rotting you're talking about. And then on top of that, I like to have a dish.
Right.
To collect the water, because maybe my neighbor below is sitting on their deck and I'm watering and down comes this water. And then, so it could be a cache pot with a pretty pot that you put around the outside of the container that maybe doesn't have drain holes and allows whatever comes out the bottom to collect. But then you have to empty that water out of that where it's collected in the container under your grow pot. And turkey basters work well for that.
Yeah, that's a good idea, too. But you just can't take that tray of water that's drained there and throw it off your balcony.
Unless you really have a strong throw and can get it very far away from any humans or other structures or vehicles nearby.
Marina was a little concerned, too, about pest problems. She wanted some tips for pest control. Fortunately for the fall and winter garden, it's not as bad as it would be if it was the spring and the summer. You'll probably get aphids.
Right. That's where your discussion of a single-digit fertilizer comes in. If you use too strong nitrogen, meaning that number is not just a single digit, or you apply that single-digit fertilizer, nitrogen is the first number in those 3 that are on a fertilizer bag. If you apply it too often, you get lots of green growth, but it's young and thin, and it is aphid candy, and you get so many aphids on it.
In a container garden, you could probably get away with just removing them by hand.
Or a hard stream of water.
A hard stream of water if you have access to a hose, and it's not going to make everybody all wet.
Exactly,
there's that. You have to be kind of careful when that goes. But I was thinking in terms of building the Good Bug Hotel along with the vegetable garden, too, right. And by putting in plants that attract beneficials.
Yes.
And so I like the idea that she had like larkspur and stock in there, but I would add some other winter bloomers that also attract beneficials.
Winter bloomers.
And of course, now we're in Santa Cruz. You know what blooms in the wintertime in Santa Cruz are Australian plants. They have a wonderful, in their botanical garden there, they have a beautiful Australian section.
I haven't been there in a long time.
Which is resplendent in December and January.
Oh, wow.
But for annual flowers, probably calendulas. I'm thinking of sort of flat daisy-like flowers that might attract more of the good guys that you want.
Sweet alyssum.
Sweet alyssum, that's easy. Yeah, that grows year-round.
Yeah, it grows year-round, and it's attractive to the beneficials that they need. Besides eating the aphid, that's their protein meal, they need some sugar, and so they need to go to a flower that's going to give them some of its sap, of its nectar, and that's what they get through the flower.
I like that idea because sweet alyssum is a plant that you could ring if it's a big enough pot. You could ring the pot
you could include it,
yes, and have whatever plant you have growing.
So the size of the pot's going to be important.
Yeah.
It's something that you want to be able to move physically, but you don't want it to be too small. If it's too small, then the plant will be limited and it will become a very difficult plant to manage because the roots will quickly fill it up and you're going to have to water all the time and it's going to get crowded and it's going to suffer. I like what we call 15s. Mm-hmm. A 15 is 18 inches tall and wide approximately. They're black, and that's a problem. But other things would be like half wine barrels, but you do have to drill holes in the bottom. Benefit of those, though, is they have nice oak bottoms, and you can just screw the wheels into the bottom.
If they're big enough wheels.
If they're big enough wheels, yeah that's
I would suggest if you're using a half barrel, use a furniture dolly.
Yes, you said that once before. That's a great idea.
Well, yes, and I've told everybody why, so I won't go through that again. There's a lot of winter bloomers that can be planted in Santa Cruz. I mean, if you go to your local nursery or even a big box store, you're going to see a fine selection of winter blooming annuals. But again, they're probably not going to get them in stock until September or October. Mm-hmm. And so that's where, you can buy seed.
Right.
And do it that way.
Right. The Sweet Alyssum is very easy from seed. It comes in colors. And so you have the big pot. You have maybe a crop of chard in it, or I don't think she mentioned chard, but that's also a nice green to grow in the winter. And around the edges you have, or amidst the chard, you have some Sweet Alyssum.
Mm-hmm. If this is all in containers, you could safely plant mint in a few pots too to attract beneficials, and it's not going to get out of control.
Right. But don't plant mint with other things. Mint will take over.
But yeah, I like that idea of Sweet Alyssum. I think that's a fine entry for the mild climate Good Bug Hotel.
And it's not such a problem. Temperature in the container is not such a problem in Santa Cruz in the winter. But if she's starting now, let's say, or in the next month, those black grow pots could heat up tremendously. And so that causes the media to become very hot. Temperatures of 140 degrees in a half an hour have been recorded. And that means you've got dead roots wherever that part of the pot is being hit by sun. You need to prevent that. And to prevent that media from heating up, you can do a bunch of basic things. You can wrap it in that frost cloth we were talking about if you have any left over.
Which is also good for pest control.
Yes.
By keeping them from landing in the first place.
Right. They can't. Yeah. They can't get to the plant.
All right.
And some clothespins or tape it around the pot. You can put aluminum foil on the sunny side of the pot and it will reflect the sun off. You can get some spray paint, and I've done this with students, and just clean the pot off with a nice rag and then spray that side that's going to be facing the sun, or spray the whole thing so you have options. And that reflects enough light that it doesn't allow the roots to get that hot.
You have favorite colors?
We used light colors, but I got silver and gold and white and pink and yellow and let them do whatever they wanted on their pot.
Okay. Did it bring down since you were teaching a class, there had to be soil thermometers involved in this?
No, there weren't, unfortunately.
Oh.
Yeah, that would have been a good check. Oh. But nothing burned.
Okay. All right. That's good. I think really the big question, though, is, Marina, are your food habits the same as the people you're living with? Will it be their food habits as well? In other words, you want to plant food crops that everybody's going to enjoy.
Right, that you're actually going to eat.
Yeah, you don't want to waste them. Unless you could have a worm bin, I guess, inside. You could feed them the leftovers. Mm-hmm. That too. Mm-hmm. But Marina's off to a good start here, and I think she will be successful.
I think so, too. Just don't do too much too fast.
All right, Marina, thanks for writing in. Debbie, thanks for your help.
Oh, I'm pleased to have helped, Fred.
Coming up after this, we have 11 tips for garden success as we continue with the 2023 Garden Basics Greatest Hits, Part 1. The weather may not be perfect for outdoor gardening right now, but now's the time to plan the what and the where of what you want to plant for the future. And to help you along, it pays to visit your favorite independently owned nursery on a regular basis throughout the fall and winter just to see what's new. And coming soon to that nursery near you is Dave Wilson Nursery's excellent lineup of farmers market favorites. Great tasting, healthy fruit and nut varieties. They'll already be potted up and ready to be planted. And we're also talking about a great selection of antioxidant-rich fruits, such as blueberries, blackberries, raspberries, goji berries, grapes, kiwi, mulberries, gooseberries, figs, and pomegranates. Wholesale grower Dave Wilson Nursery has probably the best lineup of great tasting fruit and nut trees of any grower in the United States. Find out more at their website, davewilson.com. And while you're there, check out all the videos they have on how to plant and grow all their delicious varieties of fruit and nut trees. Plus, at davewilson.com, you can find the nursery nearest you that carries Dave Wilson's plants. Your harvest to better health begins at davewilson.com. During 2023, Debbie Flower and myself hit the road. We were talking gardening with garden groups throughout Northern California, but only one of those live appearances made it to the top 10 of Garden Basics podcast listeners. It was recorded last May at the Lincoln Hills Garden Club and played back in episode 271. Unfortunately, Debbie was on vacation at that time, so it was just me and a PowerPoint demonstration talking to a jam-packed auditorium about the 11 tips for garden success. Wanted to talk about what originally was entitled Farmer Fred's Garden Rules, but I received so much, shall we say, negative feedback about using the word rules that one nurseryman said, be a little gentler. Call it something else. So it's Farmer Fred's 11 Garden Tips for Success. And actually in gardening, there are no rules really, because if it works for you, well, who am I to say no? In fact, that's one of the garden rules, but we'll get into all that between now and whenever, and then we'll take your questions afterwards. All right, 11 Garden Tips for Success. Right plant, right place. Oh, for sure. You don't plant tomatoes in the shade. You don't plant roses in the shade either. But then again, you wouldn't put a hydrangea in full sun. Well, you could, and maybe not enjoy the results. But again, we come back to all gardening is local. If you live in the Bay Area, where it's foggy half the time, you could probably get away with growing a hydrangea in what passes there for full sun. Winter Daphne, impatiens as well, they like it on the north side of the house. And know the sunlight requirements for your plants. Those tags on the plants or on the seed packet, they're usually right. So try to follow those. So again, full sun, usually 8+ hours a day, 6 to 8, okay. Part sun is usually 4 to 6 hours of sunlight per day. If it's less than 4, that's considered shade, partial shade, full shade. Sunset Western Garden Book. You remember that book? How many of you have a copy of the Sunset Western Garden Book? Ah, good for you. How old is it? I'll tell you how old it is. It's at least 11 years old for the Sunset Garden Book. There hasn't been a new edition since 2011, although I hear rumors from my friends in the industry that, we're putting another copy together. Well, please do. We enjoy it because there are so many copies and editions of the Sunset Western Garden Book. It really is an indispensable book for California gardeners and Western United States gardeners. The cover has changed over the years. The 2011 version is the version you see on the left. The 2001 version is that one on the right. And they change the information just about every issue too. Because they can only put in so many pages, they'll drop whole sections or add new sections. But they have really good planting information at the start of the book where they list all the plants for various conditions. Are you looking for a privacy screen to grow in full sun that gets 15 to 20 feet tall? Well, here's a list. Are you looking for low-growing ground covers for the shade? Here's a list. It's worth it just for that list alone. And if you go on Amazon right now and try to find a copy of the Sunset Western Garden Book, you're going to see some ridiculous prices, like over $100. There's nothing wrong with used copies. All right, mulch. Anybody know me? They know I love mulch. I buy it by
10 yards at a time. And this was when we lived in Harold and we had 10 acres and I was mulching a lot. But mulch does a whole host of good for your garden. Mulch, it retains moisture, it keeps soil temperature constant, it reduces plant stress, it suppresses weeds. It gradually increases the soil organic matter. It feeds the soil. It attracts beneficial organisms that improve soil fertility and porosity. The mulch encourages plants, healthier plants, because it reduces the needs for pesticides and fertilizers. One of the very good benefits, practical benefits of mulch around trees, you won't run into the tree with your lawnmower or your weed whacker if there's a 12-inch radius of mulch around that tree. Now, theoretically, that mulch layer should actually go out as far as the tree limbs go out. But if you can do 12 inches around the base of the tree, not touching the tree trunk, but near the base of the tree, you're going to keep that tree trunk safe from mechanical injury, which is the number one cause of tree failure in our area. Lawnmowers banging into it, or just getting a little too close with that weed whacker, and there goes a piece of the bark. Yeah. Mulch does a wonderful thing. And of course, it can suppress the spread of brush fires too around on rural areas and around homes. There's just so much good about mulch. Now, I like to mulch with my neighbor's leaves. My neighbor has a 50-foot oak tree in their front yard. And every November and December, I'm out there raking her leaves. He says, thank you. I say, thank you, because I'm taking those leaves back to my place. I'm putting them in a metal trash can. I get out my weed whacker. I put that inside the metal trash can, a string trimmer, and grind up those leaves really small. Or I'll spread it out on the patio and run over it with my mulching mower to make those leaves really small. And then I'll take those leaves and throw them on top of my raised beds at the end of the summer gardening season. So it's not a case of the bed lying fallow. It's slowly getting fed by 4 or 5 inches of leaves on top of that garden soil. And usually I'll go a few degrees further than that too. Before I put the leaves on top of that bare garden bed, I'll go and buy some bags of good green waste compost and put that on the bed. I'll also mix in some worm castings too, and then put the leaves on top of that and just let it sit there. Another good reason to mulch your garden area and your garden beds, it breaks up the rain. People don't realize the force of a raindrop and how much a raindrop can actually destroy and compress and compact soil particles, destroying the air in the soil. I ride a bike a lot, and if I ever get caught in a rainstorm, one thing about rain and being on a bike, it stings. When it's falling, it's rather painful. So you put your head down, you pedal faster. The raised bed can't do that. It has to take it, but you're compacting the soil. But by putting a layer of mulch on top, when the rain hits the mulch, it then just gently trickles into the soil. It does so much good. Mulch. Everybody should be mulching. Mother Nature bats last. I say that to a lot of people. I'll give you the best example going right now. Tulare Lake. Tulare Lake existed 150 years ago. And then it disappeared after farmers started digging ditches around and moving that water around so they could farm the land. Well, there's been so much rain and so much snow that the southern Central Valley has got a new lake back. This was a lake where there were actual sailboat rides from Bakersfield to San Francisco back in the late 1800s. And that was only, a foot or so deep, so they must have been really small sailboats. But the fact of the matter is that area is so low, and it's getting lower because of subsidence from pumping groundwater, that the lake is going to be there. Water finds a way. Mother Nature bats last. But lend Mother Nature a helping hand when it comes to battling the bad bugs. First of all, identify the bug. You saw an excellent example here talking about ladybugs, and especially the larval form of the ladybug. I like to call them the teenage ladybug in the San Francisco Giants warm-up jacket, because it's kind of black and orange. And you see those and you think, bug, get the spray. No, don't. That's the baby ladybug. So identify any bug before you take action. And by working with Mother Nature, one of the best forms of action you can take is just spray those plants with water if it's aphids. Just spray it with water. It'll knock them off the plant. They're soft-bodied insects. They're not going to recover. Control the ants, too, because ants herd aphids around. Ants don't like boric acid. If you put out some boric acid bait, and you can buy them in little plastic canisters or in bigger containers, they'll take that boric acid back to the ant nest, and before too long, you don't have an ant problem. It'll take a couple of weeks, but it does work. Start with the least toxic alternative when it comes to battling pests. Right plant in the right place also dissuades insects too. You need beneficials. And the best way to attract beneficials in your yard is to, what I like to say, is plant the Good Bug Hotel. The Good Bug Hotel are plants that attract beneficial insects. And you want plants that are in bloom at some point in the year, but have enough different plants so that there's always something in bloom. And people say, well, what do you get in the wintertime to attract beneficials? Rosemary. Rosemary blooms in the wintertime, does a great job. One of the longest lasting blooming plants, and it blooms from May through December, the California buckwheat. California buckwheat especially, the Zauschneria, although I think they've changed the names. I don't know why they keep changing the names of plants. I think it's just because they can. It's sort of like, why are you updating my computer again? Why do I have to change my system again? Well, I think horticultural nerds like to change names because they can. But basically, putting in plants that attract them is going to attract them for pollen. Putting in plants where they want to live, that's even better, and it's usually evergreen plants. Birds do a great job of controlling insect pests. And if you have a lot of evergreen shrubs in your yard, you're going to attract year-round birds. Now, you may say, well, the birds are eating my crop. They're eating my sunflower leaves or whatever, but they're also eating a heck of a lot of bugs. Having nothing to do one afternoon, I was watching the robins in the yard when they weren't eating the blueberries. And they were hopping into the raised bed. And at the time in the raised beds, there was nothing growing there. And I go, what are they doing? And I watched them, and they were actually digging down and finding the white grubs and taking those off. Now, I sort of primed the pump for them because as I was mixing in compost and worm castings, and I dug down and you find these white C-shaped grubs, I would just throw them over my shoulder. The birds are always watching you. You know, it's not just the Chinese government. Birds are watching you all the time. And they will see where that white grub went. And they will see where it came from, too. And that's exactly what these robins did. And the robins call in the whole family. They'll bring in 15 or 20 robins at a time. They don't stay for very long, but they come in, they swoop down, they dig around, they grab something, and they leave. I don't have any grubs left. And so they'll find somebody else who has them. Try to get away from using powerful insecticides. Start with least toxic alternatives whenever it comes to controlling pests or diseases or weeds. And there's always something of a mechanical, cultural, or physical control that you can use to control pests. It might be if the plant is so heavily infested with something like whiteflies, it might be a case of, well, let's get rid of the plant. But it also might be a case of, let's not plant so many of those and give those plants better air circulation so they won't attract so many pests. That's why Mother Nature can be your ally if you let her. Yes, what old is new again? This is one of my favorite studies that was developed by the University of Texas, and I want to read it to you. That was done back in around the year 2004. And it was a study of heirloom vegetables. And the conclusion of this research at the University of Texas was that supermarket vegetables available in 1950 were healthier than the ones purchased in 1999. So at the University of Texas, they basically tested all these vegetables back in 1950 for their nutrients. Then they tested them again in 1999. Well, what happened between 1950 and 1999 that caused a decline in the nutrients of the vegetables you buy at the supermarket? It was hybridization. Hybridization, the development of crops that produce bigger crops, quicker crops, more resistant to cold weather or pests. And when you develop these new hybrid varieties and give that plant a little extra oomph in one area, it takes away something. And what the University of Texas has described it as being that the emerging evidence suggests that when you select for yield, crops grow bigger and faster, but they don't necessarily have the ability to make or uptake nutrients at the same faster rate. This is a perfect argument for growing it yourself. When you're growing hybrid varieties, choose older hybrid varieties like the early girl tomato or heirloom varieties. Heirloom varieties and those other varieties that have been around for 50, 60 years that are still technically hybrid, but they act more like heirlooms. It depends on what your definition of heirloom is. And trust me, there's a lot of definitions of what an heirloom vegetable might be. The benefits of growing it yourself are more and more clear. To attract beneficial insects to your yard, use non-hybrid flowers. Use the old-time flowers, the heirloom varieties of blooming flowers, because they're attracted to the fragrance. That's another thing that disappears in flowers that are new hybrid varieties with bigger blooms or longer seasons of bloom. They don't have as much fragrance, and the bugs know that. So stick with the old varieties. Interesting research going on up in the Sierra foothills on the San Juan Ridge at the Felix Gillette Institute. The late Amigo Bob started this probably 15, 20 years ago. He noticed as he was walking the trails and just walking around up there in Nevada County that there's a lot of Gold Rush era fruit and nut trees that are still producing. Well, how could that be? They haven't been taken care of. Nobody's pruning them. Nobody's watering them. These things have survived forest fires, drought, insects, and whatever. What's in these species? Well, they have been abandoned, but they may have the key for the future of plants because they obviously have genetically modified themselves to withstand fire, to withstand drought. So the Felix Gillette Institute, in combination with the University of Oregon, are studying these old fruit trees and seeing what they can get from them to make newer varieties that are more resistant to the ravages of the modern day. And if you go to the Felix Gillette Institute online, they're selling their fruit that they're getting from their orchards that they have developed from these old gold miner era fruit trees, very unusual varieties that you've never heard from, and some of them are very, very tasty. So if you go to the Felix Gillette Institute, consider making a donation to their efforts, and you'll get a box of fruit.
That was just a portion of episode 271, 11 Tips for Garden Success. By the way, those 11 tips will also be a part of today's transcript of this episode. Next week, it's part 2 of 2023's greatest garden basic hits. The Garden Basics with Farmer Fred podcast comes out once a week on Fridays, and it's brought to you by Smart Pots and Dave Wilson Nursery. The Garden Basics podcast is available wherever podcasts are handed out, and that includes our homepage, gardenbasics.net, and that's where you can also find transcripts of most episodes as well. Thank you so much for listening or reading.